G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and not like me having to update every single thing any of my credit cards are accounted for because some of my numbers maybe have gotten taken. Anyway, it's all right. It was Amex picked up on it before someone could book a flight off some shitty website. Anyway, today, of course, we're going to talk about Ukraine, some things going on. We're going to talk about the maps. We're going to look at some assessments of the maps, as well as some sympathisers, some deals going down in the Black Sea, and a look over a few other things and some little bits and pieces that I thought were interesting. Now, we have seen more and more footage coming up of the Challenger 2 tanks. Of course, Britain's main battle tank that it sent across to Ukraine. Now, interestingly, a Charlie 2 has never been lost in combat, which is somewhat incorrect. One has been lost, but it was a blue on blue, I believe, from another Challenger 2. Anyway, here is a video of another Challenger 2 on the front line here. Now, this is very interesting, as I'll explain. Now, this definitely has been used a lot. You can just see in the bar armor here, of course, which protects from things like RPGs. You can see it's dirty, there's bends in it, things like this. That doesn't mean that it's been hit at all, but it does show me that these are being used on the front line because the footage we've got is like this. It's sitting, driving around, whatever. We aren't seeing like drone footage, GoPro footage, whatever, of these on the front line. Will we see that? Of course. Does it exist? Probably. Either I haven't found it or it's being very, hidden away of where that actually is going. But this is proving that these are working on or near around the front lines. Now, not much exciting happens in this video. He sort of bags up the engine and drives away here in front of some shirtless soldiers. So that is about it. But we do know that these are operating in and around the front line. Now, what is interesting, and I guess if you believe it, that it was originally speculated that the Charlies were only going to be used once a breakthrough was achieved. And it's only been the last few days where we've actually really seen these looking like that near or on the front line, around soldiers, dirty, obviously in some level of use. So it could be entering that stage where then we see the Charlies come in. Well, that was what was speculated. The Leopards would be in the beginning and then the Charlies, whatever. But again, no evidence of that. That is just speculation. Now, there's a few other little interesting things we have seen as well. So a Swedish RTRV 122, which is basically just an advanced model of a Leopard 2A5, I believe, has been seen on the front line here as well in this photograph. Now, this isn't anything new, but it is interesting that it does have the Barracuda MCS camouflage, which is like this, some will say like a cape over the vehicles. And this we're seeing on most, well, I should say most, on a lot of modern armoured equipment. Now, this really, what it does is it decreases the vehicle's detection. So from thermal IR and radar spectrums, it just reduces that actually coming in and out. It does similar to like the paint on, say, like an F-22, F-35. Of course, doing it in a vastly different way, but the end product is somewhat the same. And I think it looks pretty cool on them. Now, this is actually the same that we have seen. I should bring this back up. It's the same that we see used on the CV-90 as well. Now, notably, a CV-90 was captured complete by Russia with this camouflage on them as well. Ukraine has also captured T-90M Provi 3 tanks that have the same camouflage cape on them, I believe. Now, this definitely does exist for those tanks, and this is some photos of that captured one here as well. So, with the IR cape, as people say. So we can assume that these have gone to different scientific departments, either in the West or into Russia, and they're looking at how does this actually work, what differs, and go from there with a lot of other equipment as well. We spoke yesterday about the senior NATO official Stian Jensen, how he spoke about that an option could be that Ukraine could give up some territory to Russia in exchange for NATO membership. Well, he has apologised since he's actually suggested that. And we're going to go over what he said. Now, VG, I'm not sure if it's short for something, but this is the Norwegian newspaper that first released what he said, and then they've had this article on him as well. My statement about this was part of a larger discussion about possible future scenarios in Ukraine, and I shouldn't have said it that way. It was a mistake. If, and I emphasize if, you get to the point where you can negotiate the military situation on the ground, territory, who controls what, will be absolutely central. and will be necessary to have a decisive influence on how a possible outcome of this war will look out. Precisely for this reason, it is crucially important that we support the Ukrainians with what they need. And then he talks about the security guarantees. After all, we have an interest in ensuring that this does not happen again. The day the war ends, regardless of how it ends, and then Ukraine absolutely has to get credible security guarantees that secure their future. Also adding, there are no signs that the Russians have finished their war of aggression. But like he said on Tuesday when it first came out, he did emphasize that the Ukrainians themselves must assess that on their own terms and terms that they will be willing to enter into negotiations and what they are willing to then negotiate about. So it was asked, is there a desire in NATO to start a discussion about the beginning and the end of this war? Now you can see here this Skoda, which is, I don't know if you own one, I don't know, this is a fucking ugly car, but I've added some fucking cool bits onto it just to spice it up a little bit. But no, I will be careful not to speculate too much about it. I think he learned his lesson. I think the most important thing now is that we support the Ukrainians. They are in the middle of a counter-offensive. Many have commented that it is going a little slower than they had hoped, and I would still like to add a seed of optimism to this. As I said in the own little debate, one must remember that at the outbreak of the war, there was concern that Ukraine would collapse within weeks or days. It has not happened at all. They've shown a heroic effort against a superior power. To me, this was definitely a case of, and we see this again and again and again on social media, it's probably happened to me, but whatever, is where you do something longer form and bits and pieces are pulled out, and then, you know, people respond to exactly what was said, not the entirety of it. But in this, he doesn't roll back really on what he said. He just confirms exactly what I guess he meant. But we do know that at some point this war will have to end in some level of diplomacy, and there may be negotiations on the table. We don't know how it's going to end, and I think that's really what he's getting at. But I bet he landed himself in some hot water, because we did see an amount of officials get very angry over those comments made. Now as well, Ukraine will not be getting F-16s anytime soon. So the Air Force spokesman Yuri Inhut, who I've spoken about before, stated on Ukrainian television, "It's already obvious we won't be able to defend Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets during this autumn and winter." Continuing, he says, "We had big hopes for this plane, that it will become part of air defense, able to protect us from Russian missiles and drones." And there's been no real time frame given on these aircraft yet, or even numbers. It seems like there's a lot of information either being held back or actually not there. The decisions haven't really been made. Will we see them next year? Potentially. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. Will these make an absolute game-changing effort? No one single bit of kit can actually make that change. But Ukraine has been asking for these for an amount of time, and it's still going to be a long time. I've spoken about the challenges with airframes like this before, and it's something that can definitely be overcome and put into a country, even more difficult, a country at war, what is still having missiles fired in and successfully also striking targets. So it's going to be a bigger challenge again, but the time frame, the cost, the maintenance of these, that is going to be a huge challenge, and we may see them on the next year or so, but I wouldn't be hanging my hat on it. As well, Security Services of Ukraine, the SBU, have released video footage of their sea-going drone that has had a number of strikes into the Black Sea. So we have footage here of the Sea Baby. That's a good name. Sea Baby for a drone like this, great name. Storm Shadow for a missile, shit name. I like ironic names like this. And then we have the SBU has released some stuff with then the CNN talking about this. So the head of the SBU, Vasil Malik, has told CNN the drone used called Sea Baby was a result of months of development. He says the sea surface drones are a unique invention of the Security Services of Ukraine. None of the private companies are involved. Using these drones, we have recently conducted a successful hit of the Crimean Bridge, the big assault ship Olengorsky Gonyak, and the SIG tanker. Those are the ones we've seen over the previous few weeks. As well, continuing, we are working on a number of new interesting operations, including in the Black Sea waters. I promise you, it'll be exciting, especially for our enemies. Talking there's going to be a lot more of these drones used in attacks into the Black Sea. Malik said Ukraine's Western partners had shown an interest in their operations and a desire to learn from their experience, saying they do not participate in our operations or provide us with any equipment or anything else. These drones are produced at an underground production facility at the territory of Ukraine. The targets I've mentioned are legitimate targets according to the Ukrainian and international laws. So, of course, the tanker and the Olengorsky ship, seagoing and aerial drones, this is nothing new to warfare, but what is really new that we're seeing in this conflict is the ability to make these in masse at a low cost and be operated by people with a few hours of training, especially using off-the-shelf civilian components. Now, speaking of seagoing vessels, last week Ukraine announced a humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea to allow ships to leave its ports. Now, Ukraine promised full transparency to make clear they were serving no military purpose. This comes as Russia did not extend the Black Sea grain deal after the Kerch Bridge was struck. So it ended the day after, and Russia didn't sign on to re-go. Now, there has been threats that ships could be targeted by Russia. A Hong Kong flag vessel, Joseph Schult, which had been trapped in Odessa since February 22, left Odessa and out the Bosphorus. And this is then the photograph of the Joseph Schult here. Ukraine has just made an important step towards restoring the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. The first civilian vessel has passed through Ukraine's new humanitarian corridor. Departing from the port of Odessa, it's currently on its way to the Bosphorus. Earlier, Ukraine had officially notified the International Maritime Organization of the corridor's operation. The IMO reaffirmed Ukraine's right to ensure freedom of navigation and urged Russia to cease threats and uphold international conventions. A safe sea for all. This is Ukraine's and our partners' principled stance. Freedom and safety of navigation are fundamental international principles. And we do know that both Ukraine and Russia are superpowers when it comes to the export of agricultural product, grain, wheat, things like this. It's very, very important that those corridors remain open, not just for developing countries, but also Western countries as well, as inflation hits all-time highs in many places in the world. Now, I've spoken a lot before about how there's still a population of civilians in Ukraine who are incredibly sympathetic towards the Russians. In the north and east especially, this is still very prevalent. Even when I was there, many soldiers warned us of the dangers of sympathisers who could call in targets on us, like ring up and, hey, there's people here, or would actually take some pot shots at you. So the Kiev Independent wrote an article titled "Pro-Russian Sympathies Make Life Harder for Soldiers, Cops in the Kupiansk District." Subjectively speaking, there are many separatists here, people who hate us on principle. Kupiansk is not a separatist city as such. According to local police, pro-Russian people were in the minority, especially before most residents fled west. But closeness to the Russian border, prolonged Soviet entanglement, and non-stop access to Kremlin propaganda conspired to breed resentment and pro-Russian sympathies at higher rates than normal. This can be deadly for troops and the civilians who help them. Multiple soldiers told the Kiev Independent that their living quarters were targeted in ways that suggest that someone fed coordinates to the enemy. A few soldiers quipped that people in the local marketplace were the first to know to clear out of the way when there was something incoming. When asked how this affects morale, most soldiers had something ironic to say. The morale fell long ago. We just got used to it. Duskovsky reckons that about 50% of the current local population remains pro-Russian. Remember, the people that are pro-Ukrainian, a lot of them have left, so these numbers do get skewed one way or another. These same numbers were then cited by a group of civilians talking about their town of Kyiv-Sharivka. Now, local police who hunt for collaborators and might have a more precise picture had much lower estimates. This gentleman, the head of prevention in the Kupiansk district police force, believes the percentage does not exceed 15 to 20%. A Ukrainian police officer who escaped from occupied Kupiansk after being arrested and tortured by the Russians said that close to 85% of the original pre-occupation police force turned and started working for the occupiers. These people fled to Russia when Kupiansk was liberated. So that is very interesting, that 85% of them turned over to working for the Russians, and then when Ukraine was coming back through to liberate Kupiansk, then they went in through to Russia. Now, there are many, many different reasons why things like this can happen. As a result of the danger posed by collaborators, troops are spending less time in the towns and villages and more time in the countryside in dugouts, according to a soldier with the call sign Uklon and his mates. Police and civilians pointed out that there are plenty of people in Kupiansk district who actively support Ukrainian troops in this area. Many people are providing living space and food to the Ukrainian soldiers, and people understand that without the guys, the troops, there would be disaster. So you can absolutely understand why people are hostile towards soldiers. It may not be what uniform the soldiers are wearing. It may not be where they're from. It's because if soldiers are present there, there is absolutely an increased risk of an attack, of shelling, of things like this. People just don't actually want to be near soldiers. They just want to, a lot of people just want to be like, no, if you're near me, that's increasing my risk of being hit. And as well as under occupation force, people collaborating, things like this, that is absolutely going to happen. These people going back to Russia when Ukraine was liberating from there, well, if they were seen to be helping the occupation force, well, they're going to be in a hell of a lot of trouble with then the Ukrainians too. So you can absolutely understand that, and things that have happened to people before who were collaborating with the enemy, no matter which way they see the enemy, if that makes sense. But in my opinion, this is absolutely just the beginning of this issue. If this counteroffensive leads Ukraine into areas under Russian control and influence since 2014, being Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, places like that are even more densely populated, this is going to be harder than ever to control, especially as these areas already have large pro-Russian separatist armed movements that we haven't even seen the start of this. If and when Ukraine enter those regions, that separatist movement is going to be even worse than they're dealing with currently. That most places where Ukraine are fighting, the majority of the civilian populace is on their side. It could be a very different view when they cross into some of those areas where there's going to be a higher percentage maybe of sympathizers. Maybe not overall, but there's still going to be a lot of different elements working in there. And it's going to become very, very difficult. So it will be interesting to see if and when that then happens. So let's then have a look over the maps, as there has been some small but interesting developments. So of course we have Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, and the purple since 14. The purple are the bits we were just talking about to do with sympathizers. Now the big news of the day, if we come down into here, is Uruzani has been confirmed that it has been completely liberated by the Ukrainian forces. So let's jump onto then the satellite map, and we can then see where Uruzani is here. So the map just had to update, and we can see that Uruzani has been completely occupied by the forces, and we just see that small move there. Of course, the blue just shows the stabilization. Ukrainian officials have said that their soldiers have taken up positions on the outskirts of Uruzani, but that is really the only change we see anywhere on the deep state map. But we are going to talk about this across some other maps just to double check and confirm. So Surek Maps does confirm that Uruzani has come under complete Ukrainian control, as well as Rybar Russian sources map here does show that Uruzani is under Ukrainian control. But then if we come across onto the Ukraine daily map update, and of course Uruzani sits up here where we just spoke about, this shows the same update, but we jump down into Robotyne. Now we know Robotyne is majority under Ukrainian either control or in grey zone at the moment. There's very active fighting going on there, and there's a lot of rumours to and from what is actually happening there. But we do see that just on the west, that Ukraine did make more territory here. They took this chunk as well, and they did manage to clear more grey zone on the east of Robotyne. So if we go back a couple of days, you can just see this working through here, that Ukraine has been pushing more ground here and create this grey zone extending over Robotyne here. So has Robotyne completely come under Ukrainian control yet? No, these maps are still showing it in grey zone. This is the same on the deep state map. The deep state is still showing some of it within Russian controlled territory, but people are very quick to jump on, well, they're there, and then Tokmak is next. Tokmak going to happen very soon. And something I would say there is, don't count your chickens before they hatch. That the offensive has come down here. There's still a long way to go to Tokmak. Now, Ukraine has managed to get some of the high ground in and around here, and maybe bringing some of those weapon systems up to be able to then reach Tokmak. If we look at the start of the counteroffensive to, let's go here and be conservative, is 7 kilometers. If we come from where we took to then, let's go to the center of Tokmak, we're talking 22 kilometers and let's say 18. So we're talking 2.5, 3 times further. And if we have a look at this, the actual defensive areas here, not that much. There's a lot of other defensive lines moving through here. So one step at a time, one village at a time. I don't think it's beginning to start talking about Tokmak. Targeting Tokmak, absolutely, as we know, this is a center and a lot is coming out of there. But is this going to happen over the next couple of days like some people are pointing at? I don't believe so. But let's have a look at Surek Map's assessment, as I love getting like a third view on some of this. With the recapture of Uruzani, the third phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is about to begin. There is a significant amount of material and human resources of the Ukrainian army deployed in the southern fronts, where it is expected that troops will launch a powerful wave of attacks, which have probably the next objective, taking the high areas west and east of the Mokry-Yaly River, thus reaching Kremenchuk-Stomalivka line, the last defense line before the first Russian main defense line. So let's talk about this. So this is where he is talking. So we're talking Samalivka here. Of course, this is then Uruzani as well as Kremenchuk. So we're talking about capturing these high points here, that this is where the Ukrainian army need to then push, capturing the high points and moving through to this first Russian defensive line, or then these main defensive lines. And number 2, take control over the town of Robotyne. Of course, we see Robotyne here, and develop the offensive further south until the first Russian main defense line. It's also expected Ukrainian forces will open another axis around the Novoporivka as many reinforcements came to that area in the last days. Here is where we're talking about, then to the northeast of Robotyne. The blue dots here is where Ukraine then need to push into, and of course the yellow being these primary defensive lines. Once the Ukrainian army reaches these objectives, it would be possible to exploit the momentum and reach one of the big towns located at the second Russian main defense line. However, if this third phase is not successful, it's very possible that Ukrainian offensive capabilities will decrease due to the attrition that the brigades have reportedly suffered in 3 months. In addition, the lack of more brigades in the reserve would pose a threat to Ukrainian forces in a situation where the Russian army is showing great capabilities to rotate and launch attacks in small scale, but extended to the entire front line, forcing Ukrainians to move troops to these axes. Nevertheless, this overextension of forces, many of them exhausted, could be exploited by the Russians to gain a breakthrough in some area of the front and start a major offensive from there. The next weeks will show us interesting and decisive events in the front line. So saying it could be very interesting over the next few weeks. Now, where he's talking about these second lines, so we're talking this darker yellow here. So if we then jump onto this map down here, so we're talking in Robotyne, that this area could be reached and then could reach down into these second, third lines down here, and of course then that is threatening Tokmak. Now, I think the most important thing then he speaks of there is momentum, that once Ukraine has that momentum to achieve the breakthrough, that momentum needs to keep up. It can't afford to get bogged down, stalled, and put back on into defensive, like we have seen much of this counteroffensive so far, but also talking that Russian forces could launch other offensives up in the northeast, drawing many reserves away from there. But if there is very high attrition, it does put a risk on the Ukrainian forces as well. I think we'll see major moves come through. I think with these challenges now coming into play, achieving a breakthrough somewhere is definitely possible, but I'm not sure how that will actually look, but we will see over the next coming weeks. Now, Surak Maps as well has said that the Russian forces were able to clear the Ukrainians of this left bank here of the Dnipro to the west of Kazachi Liri, where we have talked about, of course, down in here, but Deep State Map is just not tracking this at all, as well as the Russian forces were able to then recapture positions in the northeast near Kovalivka here. Now, this is actually where we spoke about the other day. So if we go north of Avdiivka area, so we step back a few days, we saw this here. This is Kovalivka, that the Russian forces were able to retake some of their positions there. As well, ISW has said that Russian claimed on August 15 that Russian forces repelled the entire Ukrainian presence from the left, the east bank of the Kazachi Liri. But again, this is only claimed from here. Anyway, legends, I hope you're looking after yourself. I hope you're having a great end to the week. The English bloody bet us in the soccer last night. Fuck, so now I'm going for Spain. Look after yourselves. If you'd like to support me, there's links down below. But never feel obliged. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. Cheers. Bye-bye.